All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to the channel. We had some delays with stuff that was scheduled, but that's okay. Just go with the flow. I hope everyone is having a wonderful Halloween weekend. Merry Samhain. Happy Halloween. Today you should be getting two videos. We should be getting our emotion code, not emotion code, our emotion project video that was meant to go up on Friday. And then we have our soft focus Saturday for yesterday. As I attempt to get into a rhythm with this in my family and figure out a recording schedule, that's what we're figuring out. So first thing I wanted to go over was the emotion project. So first of all, what is the emotion project? I have had a thought for a while now on going over basically where our emotions come from and how that impacts us as human beings, and maybe as children, how that would have impacted us, and then bringing in the metaphysical stuff, all the things that I love to do, and talking about how we can use our emotions to help us get rid of trauma and negative experiences. But I want to define what an emotion is first. Because first of all, your emotions are, it's just something that naturally occurs within your body. By definition, it's literally just the response that your body has and the creation of, different levels of chemicals within your body, dopamine, serotonin, things like that. And the result of all the mix of this occurs whenever your brain receives information from your outside, so from any of your senses. And it tells you almost your first response to, hey, this feels good to keep doing this, or hey, this doesn't feel so good. And it's a coping mechanism to teach you how to stay away from things or how to keep accepting things. It's something that even throughout evolution, we trust on our emotions in order to tell us if we're feeling safe or not, right? But the thing about living in the modern age with emotions, we're obviously not the same creatures that we were thousands of years ago. We don't need to rely on our emotions as much in terms to tell us what is safe and what is not. We still have situations such as abuse, or even on a minor scale, just telling us whether or not something feels right in that moment. We rely on our emotions to tell us what to do next. But when it comes to those of us who have received trauma, so when I say trauma, it's something outside of our normal emotional, psychological, spiritual, physical development, emotional as well. Something that is outside of the norm, that kind of interrupts the cycle. This can happen in a couple of different ways. This can be something that you have gained on from your parents, especially your mother, because even if our mothers are not present in our lives right now, we all had a mother. That's how we were born. It's something that we can gain ancestrally through the passing on of DNA, as well as, spiritual ancestors. And then it's just something that has happened to you throughout the course of your life. Now, usually when we talk about trauma, we talk about it in a negative sense, such as like when we say consequences, we usually mean it to a negative sense, but they're consequences. There's a reaction to everything that we do, right? So from I'm thinking of the order in which to do this. So according to Anodia Judith, and along with other psychiatrists across the country, and I mention Anodia Judith specifically because a lot of what I'm going to be talking about comes from her book, Eastern Body, Western Mind. So it's taking the psychological research that we have done on emotions and childhood development, and it's combining it with chakras for her book. I highly recommend it if you are into chakras. It kind of puts the words of, you know, all of the mystical, woo-woo, metaphysical things into a understandable light, more plain view, kind of way, as if you were looking at this like a psychiatric session or a therapy session. Now, she mentions within her book that development of the chakras begins second trimester. And we see this theme throughout research when it comes to when life begins, right? The common consensus, typically getting away from abortion and things that people believe in that respect, is that life begins, like consciousness begins, in the second trimester. That is when, to the medical establishment, and even in some spiritual circles, when you are considered a person. Because that is when, going off of this book, your psyche is being influenced by the outside world, which is true. Any stress that the mother goes through in gestation, starting second trimester on through the end of the pregnancy, affects the fetus within the womb. If a mother tenses, baby just knows, oh, mommy tensed, something's going on, I'm gonna prep. That's how come it's common to say, don't stress out a pregnant woman, because a happy mother is a happy baby. The happier and the more content and safe the mother feels, the more happy and content you will have for the baby. And for an example, if you were to, let's say the mother was in an abusive situation, all the tensing, not only just bodily harm that happens on the outside that can influence the fetus, that can remove the placenta from the uterine wall, things like that, that can end very disastrously. It will influence the emotion of fear within a fetus before they even understand what that emotion is. Because understanding the development of your emotions and learning to regulate them doesn't happen until 2 to 5 years old, right? Because that's when your sacral chakra starts developing. But starting second trimester of gestation, your root is developing. So if you think about your root chakra, that's feeling stable, that's feeling secure, that's foundations of family. And what tends to happen, and I'm going based just off of chakras right now, what tends to happen if we receive trauma to a chakra that is under development at that stage of your psyche trying to work everything out, what happens is we kick the opposite chakra to it into development early. So for example, we have a baby who is born and has to be put in the NICU for any reason. So it has to be put in the newborn intensive care unit. So then usually we have babies in plastic boxes. It's probably a different material, but just as an example, they're isolated because they have to be hooked up to tubes and cords, and if anybody tugs on anything, if the baby tugs on anything, something can go wrong, and they're constantly monitored. But one of the most important things to a baby when they're born is touch, because all of your other senses are in overdrive. Your sense of smell is going crazy. Your eyes, the world is so bright. You've gone from a dark womb. Every once in a while you might see bright light shining through your mother's skin, but it's not as bright as it would be on the outside. You know what I mean? One of the best ways to learn to regulate your own body temperature is through touch. as a baby. It's so important to hold little ones, especially when they're born early. But if we have a child who is in the NICU, maybe the mother can't breastfeed it, if that's either a choice or because of something medically going on, then that lack of touch is there, and that creates immediately an unstable root. Or not unstable, but underdeveloped root chakra. So what happens then? Think about, from your perspective, if suddenly you couldn't manage your body. You have to rely on something on the outside to take care of you, right? Which we have to do anyway as babies. That's why babies just look at everything. They have to trust everything. They don't understand depth perception. They don't understand cause and effect until they've hit that mental development stage later. So when it comes to just being a baby, people are moving you and you don't know where you're going. People tell you when you're hungry. They tell you when you're tired. That kind of thing. And you can't half understand the language anyway. You're just trying to communicate. You know what I mean? So what happens then if you have an underdeveloped root and you have to rely on machines to take care of you? Well, then what happens? The opposite of the root chakra is your crown. And that, when it's supposed to develop, is when you enter adulthood. That's between the ages of 18 and sometimes up to 30 years old, but it's up until your body stops growing. And when it comes to your crown chakra, that's when you're supposed to think of spirituality and things outside of yourself. You start thinking about the universe, and things that may not be in your control. So we have a baby who's pondering this. So it's almost as if we were to take this in a monotheistic way, mom is God. I'm going to rely on this person who smells familiar. If we're breastfeeding, it tastes familiar. Her voice sounds familiar. And she's the first thing that I see in the most ideal context. The first thing that I see when the world is bright and suddenly I'm cold and I'm not in a womb anymore. I was just squeezed out of a very small space. Or I was just ripped out of a space. Not trying to be visceral with C-section, but I was just taken out of somewhere. That's the first thing I open my eyes to. That's familiar. And that's smiling at me is mom. It's almost as if mom is God. So imagine how your emotions are then. If you don't have that root stable, you have an overactive crown where you rely so much on someone. And then what if mom grew up in a war zone? Her root is shit. Because she does not feel safe, right? She probably does not take care of her body very well. She may not bathe. It might be hard for her to take care of her teeth. She may have common urinary tract infections because she doesn't have clean clothes. And whenever mom tenses, baby knows to tense as well. One of the quickest ways to calm down a baby, again, talking about emotional development, they rely so much on what mother is doing. And as an example of this, the other day, my husband and I, we like to watch horror movies and things like that. And somebody got snapped in some way. Their body broke. And both me and him at the same time went, oh, because that hurt like a lot. My son is 9 months old. He wasn't even looking at the screen. He was looking at me. But I was holding him. And all he heard was reaction and felt me tense. And he just flails. And he starts screaming. He starts crying. Because he's like, what happened? Mommy tensed up. What happened? And It's just an instinctual response. But that's a perfect example of fear from a parent transferring over to a baby who does not know what's going on. But it's affecting their root, even if they don't consciously know what's happening. So then when we enter into when emotions actually start to develop, not develop, but understanding and regulation of emotions start developing, and creativity starts coming out, and that's when the tears start, and the tantrums, and it's the terrible twos, all that fun stuff from ages 2 to 5. When all of that begins, if you don't have a stable root and foundation, then emotional regulation isn't going to happen. And that's honestly when a lot of abuse starts taking place for children as well, is when their sacral chakra is developing between 2 and 5 years old. Whether that's seeing someone die, or if they suffer any verbal, emotional, spiritual, physical abuse, or sexual abuse. It happens during that time, and same thing happens, only instead of kicking in our crown like the root did, it'll kick in the third eye. Which, that's how, again, in stereotypical horror movies, TV shows, things like that, that's how we get psychic children. That all of a sudden these ghosts and these beings are attaching themselves to these kids. Or that's how we get teenagers, which is the opposite. When you're a teenager, when you're going through puberty, that's when your third eye is developing naturally. That's how we get psychic teenagers or possessed teenagers. And in reality, it's not like movies when this happens. But that's how we get stories of children saying, I see someone. And you can either choose to brush it off, or you have a budding little medium popping up. Those abilities happen. Or that's when they believe in fairies and imaginary friends. It's all along with their emotional development and something happening that kicked in their third eye. Now, of course, we can't prevent everything, right? I've tried. As a parent of 3 children under 5 years old, well, 5 years old and under, I've tried preventing every trauma, but it does not happen. Things are going to happen. And the biggest thing is learning how to communicate your emotions in the most healthy way possible, even when you are heightened. It's just these natural responses within your body that you're learning how to process through. And nowadays especially, it's incredibly hard. So while I was working on my Master's of Education, I came across a study, which I gotta go back and I'll get the annotations for you and everything. We'll go into it further at a later date. But I was specifically looking at theater education, because that's what my bachelor's is in. And when it comes to theatrical education, there's a complete difference than nowadays than there was like maybe 20 years ago. And that's because of the age of technology. Now, if you think of an actor, you're looking at somebody and they're supposed to be bearing their soul out to you. All their emotions are on their face. You're supposed to be able to feel all these things like they are feeling them. There's an exercise. It's very uncomfortable. But 2 people are meant to sit across from each other and repeat back to each other whatever the other person says. And you gotta look them in the eye the whole time. Years ago, this was much easier because we were used to in-person contact. Nowadays, especially if I take it from my perspective, growing up, I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. At least that's how it felt. I had a very emotionally, spiritually, and physically repressive household that I grew up in. So I was lucky if I had a phone. A lot of the communication I did with people was online. It was through texting through my email, because I figured out how to do that. And when I did have a phone, it was texting, or I was calling people on the phone. Seeing people face to face, it took me until I was in college to be able to look a person in the eye and tell them when I had a problem with them, or to be able to address something when I did something wrong, and to be able to own up to that. If you take a modern theater classroom and try to have people stare at each other in their eyes and talk, it's so difficult, because a lot of kids grew up how I did. We are communicating with people, making connections through a screen more than we are with eyes. So that emotional vulnerability is much more difficult. You got to teach people how to trust each other more. And that's incredibly difficult, because we live in an age where it is hard with face-to-face contact to learn to trust people. We don't know body cues as well anymore. And especially if we have sensitive, energetically sensitive children. And I'm saying children with the ages of like puberty to like through college. So 24, which now to me is a child, but I'm not even that much older than that. And if we do this and we try to create emotional connection, it's got to be in a different way. And it's the same thing with therapy. Nowadays, especially because of COVID, even myself, I went through parent therapy and a dialectical behavioral therapy and individual therapy. I went through a lot of therapy sessions last year. But all of it was online. All of it was through a screen. And excuse me, I could choose how people looked at me, or I could choose if I wasn't seen at all. Whereas in person, I'm constantly seen. And there's always this worry that people are going to judge you, right? When they're too busy judging themselves to even care about what's going on with someone else. Unless they're very aware, you know. So, we've entered an age where it's hard to look people in the eye. It's hard to say thank you. It's hard to express how you feel and trusting that someone is listening, right? So that's what this emotion project is meant to go over. It's meant to go over how can we use emotion, because there's 6 main emotions, at least according to Alba Emoting, which is one of the things that we'll be following for this. How can we use our emotions and process through them so that we can handle the traumatic things that have happened to us in our life? And how can we as people learn to trust our emotions again? Because there's some cases that we feel like we can't. And follow into our own strategy and authority and listen to them in terms of human design. Because even with human design, second trimester, that's when your design node and your magnetic monopole, 2 crystals, which we're going to talk about in the Soft Saturday video, because that's a rabbit hole that I went down for that one. That's when they're supposed to have entered your body. And that's when you're supposed to have received your first blueprint, 88 degrees prior to your birth, astrologically. And that's when your emotional and psychological development start happening. And you start getting patterns. Parents can tell a little bit of the personality of the baby that they're going to have. Now, if this is something that you would be interested in, I would love it if you liked, commented, subscribed, follow along with me. And we're just going to be playfully looking at how can we use our emotions to benefit us rather than feeling controlled by them. And maybe how can we help ourselves heal more, instead of feeling overwhelmed and burdened by our emotions. So I hope that you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for listening along with me. And I will see you guys for our next video, where we're going to deep dive into some of the individual emotions. And we're going to go through them. So thank you. Have a wonderful day. Bye.